All right, let's jump right into the strategic policy briefing because we've got a massive, multi-billion-dollar paradigm shift to analyze today. And I mean massive. We aren't just looking at a fancy new app or a slightly better headset here. We're talking about a fundamental re-architecting of our entire digital existence. So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the geopolitical, economic, and regulatory tremors of the impending spatial computing era.
To really wrap your head around the financial gravity of this situation, I just want you to look at this number, $10 billion. That is how much Meta proactively, deliberately slashed from their own operating income in 2021 alone just to fund this pivot. And the crazy part? That wasn't some one-off anomaly. Mark Zuckerberg literally warned his shareholders that these investments are going to grow for several more years. I mean, it is incredibly rare to see one of the world's largest companies preemptively disrupt its own hyper-profitable business model to this degree. They're doing this because they see an existential shift on the horizon, and frankly, they are terrified of being left behind. Now, the foundation for our briefing today draws entirely from Matthew Ball's authoritative analysis on the topic, which maps out exactly why these giant corporations are disrupting themselves to build this new frontier. What's great about Ball's analysis is that it pulls the conversation way past those old 1990s science fiction tropes, right? It grounds the whole thing in the very real, very immediate battles happening right now over hardware, compute power, and digital governance. It's basically the blueprint for the next generation of the internet, and the stakes for controlling it are absolutely unprecedented.
Which brings us to our first major shift, from social to spatial. Let's clearly define the architectural framework we're transitioning into.
So we are taking a massive leap here. Think about Web 2.0 for a second, the current mobile internet you use every day. It's built on 2D social media platforms, totally fragmented apps, and flat streams of text and photos. You scroll, you tap, you stare at a glass rectangle, right? But the target destination is the metaverse. We are undergoing this critical transition away from those flat platforms into a massively scaled, interoperable network of real-time, rendered 3D spatial environments. Essentially, we're moving from a digital space where you observe from the outside to a parallel digital plane where you actually exist inside the environment. It is a fundamental shift from just parsing bits on a screen to physically interacting with virtual atoms.
Moving right along into corporate positioning, Meta and NVIDIA. Let's look at how the corporate battlefield is being drawn by the major players fighting for foundational dominance. Okay, so here's the literal multi-billion-dollar question. Meta has over 3 billion monthly active users. Their advertising model is arguably one of the most successful in human history. So, why on earth would they abandon the universally recognized Facebook name and risk billions on a concept that, let's be honest, a lot of people still just associate with science fiction?
Well, the reality is that Meta's maneuver is fundamentally a survival strategy. See, right now, Meta's apps operate entirely on hardware and operating systems owned by Apple and Google. And as the source material points out, Apple's iOS ecosystem policies and Google's Android store, they act as massive gatekeepers. They extract huge tolls, often around 30%, and completely dictate the terms of engagement. So Meta's strategy? Dominate the next computing platform, so they never ever have to answer to those mobile gatekeepers again. They are pouring money into their own Oculus VR infrastructure because they want to outright own the hardware, the operating system, and the economy of the next digital era.
Meanwhile, you have NVIDIA's CEO, Jensen Huang, and he's got an equally staggering vision for all of this. He states that the economy in the metaverse will eventually be larger than the economy in the physical world. Just process that for a second. The global GDP of our physical world is roughly $90 trillion. Huang actually envisions a digital economy that completely eclipses our physical one, governed by entirely new rules of commerce, physics, and human interaction. So, while Meta is out there focusing on consumer-facing virtual worlds and headsets, NVIDIA is actually quietly building the underlying engine of this entire new reality. They supply the foundational GPUs, powering the immense data centers required to even render these massive simulations. They operate GeForce Now, which is already the second largest cloud gaming service, but most importantly, they're pushing their Omniverse platform for 3D collaboration, and they're heavily championing USD, or Universal Scene Description standards. You can kind of think of USD as the HTML of the 3D web. Basically, NVIDIA is providing the crucial interoperability layer that allow a virtual car designed in one graphics engine to be driven perfectly in a virtual world built by a completely different one. But who actually governs this space? That brings us to Section 3, the threat of absolute monopoly. We're stepping out of pure tech analysis now and into the realm of global policy.
This quote from Epic Games CEO Tim Sweeney hits the nail right on the head when it comes to the core policy issue. He warns that if one central company gains control, they will become more powerful than any government and be a god on Earth. And look, that isn't hyperbole. It is a structural reality. If a single corporation controls an entire parallel plane of human existence, their power to dictate the physics of that world, the commerce, the data flows, it could easily rival or even exceed sovereign nations. You know, the internet today was built on public, non-profit protocols. The metaverse, however, it's being built by private businesses for the explicit purpose of profit and data extraction.
Just compare these architectures of power for a minute. Today's mobile web is definitely flawed, but it's fragmented. You use different apps for different things, and your data lives in varying, somewhat isolated silos. But a centralized metaverse would acutely worsen every single one of our existing digital problems, like data security, misinformation, monopoly power, by handing absolute control of virtual atoms to a single for-profit entity. In that kind of environment, a company could have unprecedented access to your biometric data. They could track your exact eye movements and monitor everything you say and do in real time inside a world they entirely own.
Which leads us straight into global government pushback. Governments are definitely not waiting around for this dystopia to just happen.
As a policy analyst, this is where it gets really interesting, because major geopolitical powers are already taking defensive postures. Take China, for instance. The CCP is preemptively limiting gaming for minors to just a few hours a week, and their state media explicitly warned investors that the metaverse is an illusionary concept that will ultimately bite you. Because for a centrally planned government, an uncontrollable parallel world is an immediate structural threat, right? Then, on the other side, you've got the European Union executing high-level digital scrutiny. Their chief digital regulation negotiator explicitly stated that these expansion plans by big tech are deeply, deeply worrying. They recognize exactly what's at stake here.
So, regulators have a very brief window to act, and the looming battleground is immense. Policymakers are going to have to mandate open interoperability standards right now, so you aren't locked into one corporate fiefdom forever. They'll need to force export conventions for 3D assets and place strict unbreachable limits on the massive amounts of biometric and spatial data these platforms will passively collect. But here's the catch. If global governments pursue this independently, which is exactly what they're beginning to do, we are highly likely looking at the inevitable splintering of this technology into heavily regulated, isolated national metaverses that would completely fracture the whole concept of a unified global network.
And that leaves us with a critical question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. Will governments proactively establish the rules of this new digital realm right now, or will they wait to react until corporate control is already absolute? Look, the transition from bits on a flat screen to a fully immersive, multi-trillion-dollar parallel economy is undeniably underway. The technology is converging, billions are already being spent, and the battle lines are drawn. The only question now is who actually gets to write the physical and economic laws of that new reality. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Stay curious and keep your eyes on the horizon.